All right, today we're going to talk about one of the most valuable tools in your business toolkit, and that is the organizational chart. Now, most law firms, small law firms in particular, do not have a real organizational chart. And those that do often make the mistake of saying, well, Sally does this, and so Sally's at the top of that, and then there's all the things that she does, and that's supposed to be the org chart. The problem is if Sally leaves, somebody else is going to be doing those. So the number one thing that I would say to start this is make sure that the org chart is based on the tasks and responsibilities, not based on the person. People come and go. You want the org chart to be based on the tasks and responsibilities, what needs to be done and who's responsible for getting that done. All right. Now, especially for most small firms, you're going to be the CEO, you might be the CFO, and you might be the COO. All right. You might be all of those things. And if you're all by yourself, then you are all those things. You are the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, and the chief operational officer. At some point, you're going to want to have other people fulfilling this, especially if you're going to grow. But the key here is we want to get you as the owner out of doing all the tasks, right? You need to find a way to have other people be responsible for those. So ultimately, these might be three different positions. Right now, it's probably all you. Now, let's talk about what are the five major headings that I think that you need to build your org chart on. The five major responsibilities and tasks. Okay, the first, marketing. Right? You gotta get clients in the door. Now, even if you're a referral, if your entire practice is based on referrals, who's responsible for sending the thank you cards, the fruit baskets, the whatever? I mean, if you are truly working based on referral, you should be at least acknowledging when people refer you stuff, right? So even though it may not be a big task, it should be something fairly, somebody needs to be responsible for that because your position may change. All right, intake. Intake is different than marketing. Marketing is getting people to raise their hand and contact you in some fashion. Intake is that funnel. Now that they've contacted you, you start to determine, is this a lead? Is this a qualified lead? Is this someone that we can help? And run them down the funnel to determine whether or not they're going to become a client. Someone's going to need to be responsible for that. Big one, obviously, legal. All right, you're a law firm. You have to provide the service, right? So who's ultimately going to be responsible for that? It's you as the owner, but at some point you might have a senior lawyer who actually is in charge of all of that. And then they just report to you. You could certainly build your firm in a way. I mean, that's essentially the way things are now. I'm kind of a COO, but I answer, to Martin, who is the owner. But I have a lot to say about what goes on in the legal thing because I have the most experience in the firm. HR. All right. One of the biggest overlooked things is, especially in states like California where there's so many rules, you've got to have somebody be responsible for that. Who's responsible for making sure that all the things that fall under HR get done. All right. And then finally, finance. Now, money, right? Now, you might add to that, to this, but I would say that these are the basics and everything else is going to fall under that. And what ultimately you're going to want is you're going to want someone who is in charge of marketing that reports to you, who is in charge of intake that reports to you, or maybe reports to the COO and then reports to you, legal, HR, and financial. So let's talk about the tasks that fall under these categories and just understanding how the org chart itself works. All right, so what falls under marketing? Well, for most firms, I don't know what the percentages are, but I would say that it's probably 95% or more. You have a website. Well, who's keeping track of that? Who's keeping an eye on that? It may not be a daily job, right? It's just, is it up? Is there something on it that's not, setting? Do we want to change something in it? Is it operating the way it's supposed to do? Most websites, have things that move around and different stuff that you want to pop up. Is that occurring? SEO. SEO is the back of your website. So you want someone responsible for the front of your website. You also want someone responsible for the back end of your website, right? Are you getting leads? Google. No matter how you feel about it, Google is the elephant in the room. You've got to deal with Google. You cannot not deal with them. So, who's responsible for interfacing with them, working with them, doing the pay-per-clicks or all of the other stuff? Who's responsible? Now, it may be one person is responsible for all of this. I'm not saying that this is, you have to have a whole team, but I'm saying that you do need to have somebody who's responsible for each component. All right. And then blogs and videos, right? Maybe that's social media. Right? If you have that stuff going on, and you should have blogs and videos for sure for your website, you may or may not be doing social media, although I would encourage most people to do that. But who's responsible for it? Who's making sure that all this stuff is getting posted and recorded and done, right? Right now, in my little organization, I'm responsible for all this stuff. But at some point, I will have other people doing that. All right, intakes. So marketing gets people to raise their hand at the beginning of the funnel. Now the intake, you brought them into your funnel. So what is that? That's going to be phones, right? And scripts. All right. Now, these are two different things, right? The person who is answering your phone, who's responding, to the calls and whatnot, probably isn't responsible for writing the script. Now, you'll want their input. How is that script playing? But ultimately, who's responsible for the script? Now, maybe you have them responsible for the script, but somebody has to be responsible for what they're going to say, not just the performance that they're doing. We call it client interview. When PI firms work a little bit differently. If somebody calls you, try to, get them to sign on the dotted line in that first call. For our practice area, because we do criminal defense and mostly felony work, our goal is to get them to an appointment so we can sit kneecap to kneecap, eye to eye, and talk to the client and decide whether or not we want to represent them and whether or not they can afford us. And, that whole process. Who's responsible for that? Who's responsible for making sure that there's people who are doing that and that there's a script and there's an understanding? The key for us, and I would argue for every firm, is to show value before you talk about price, right? We never talk about price on the phone. We want to talk about value. What value can we bring to the table? And then we could talk about the price. Contract. I don't think most people think about this, but I do fee arbitrations for the county bar. And I get to see other attorneys' contracts. And I will tell you, most of them are junk. Most of them do not comply with the ethical requirements, at least the ones that I'm seeing, okay? And I'm only seeing the ones, where there's a complaint. So, that is a fairly small percentage. But the contracts that I see are not state bar compliant. So, and rules change. And especially involving flat rate. Flat rate is a little tricky. Your contract needs to say certain things and the client needs to sign off on certain things, or you can't do real flat rate. You can't just put that money in your operating account. You got to put it in the trust account. It's not rocket science, but someone's got to be responsible for making sure that contract is valid and enforceable. And then, what are you charging per hour? What are you doing? Do you have a consult fee? What are all the other things? Who's responsible for that? Okay, someone has to be. And then payment plans. All right. Now, I know that a lot of people don't do payment plans, but I will tell you, payment plans changed our financial future because there were people who we wanted to help, we could help, but didn't have $5,000 to hand us. So we put them on a payment plan. This was especially true for DUIs. But if you're going to have payment plans, you got to have somebody authorizing it. You got to have guidelines of what, how much are you going to require down? What's the minimum payment plan that you're going to do? Are you going to charge interest? How are you going to deal with it if they're late? All of those things need to be part of your contract, and that needs to be approved by somebody, and somebody needs to keep an eye on that. And then if you change your rates, which we did a number of times, you've got to make sure that all that's up to date. All right, legal. Case management. Calendaring. Training. Right? Case management. How do you process your cases? When they come in, what's the first thing you do? What's the second thing you do? For us, usually the first thing is to request the discovery, right? We talk to the client, we know what they say. Now we want to see the police reports. Our firm, we work in multiple counties, so calendaring is super important for us. It is not uncommon for us to have to appear in 3 counties at the same time. How are we making sure that is getting covered? The calendar is important. Now, who's responsible for that? Who's doing your training? Who's making sure that everything's consistent? What do you do when you bring someone new in? Discovery, right? And I don't think it matters whether you're criminal, family law, bankruptcy, whatever. Discovery is just the information that's coming in that needs to be processed. How does that get processed? Who processes it? Who makes sure that the documents are named properly, and who makes sure that they're in the right files, whether it be electronic or paper? Somebody needs to be responsible for that, right? I would say client communication, client comm, right? Who's making sure that your clients are being informed about what's going on? The biggest complaint to the state bar, failure to communicate. So having somebody who's responsible for it doesn't mean that they have to do it, right? Being responsible and having to do it is different. Calendaring, the people who have to do it are the people, the lawyers. When they set a new date, they're supposed to put it in the system. But who's responsible for making sure that all happens? Well, somebody needs to, be going through that periodically and going, okay, who's responsible for that? And especially if you have paper and electronic files, which we did for a long time, making sure that the paper files corresponded to the electronic files, that was something that we would do once a month, just to go over and make sure we're not missing anything, because you don't want to miss a court appearance. And then, motions, trial prep, all of that stuff. Who's going to be responsible for that? Who? Not necessarily who's going to do it. At the end, when the last few trials I did, I rarely did the motions. I had other lawyers do the motions, okay? And then I would just supervise it, but I wasn't physically doing them. But ultimately, I was doing the trial. Okay. HR, probably one of the biggest overlooked things, especially when you're small. But as I said, in California in particular, there's lots of rules. Making sure that the bar fees are paid, making sure that there's a whole trust account thing that we have to do now in California, making sure that that's dealt with. We're having a challenge with that with one of our lawyers, and it's a mistake of the bar, but we got to stay on top of it, or if he gets his license pulled, we got a problem, right? Benefits, right? And that includes salary. So are you keeping current with, what's going on in the world? Who, is somebody entitled to or has earned a raise and maybe some bonuses? Who's tracking all that? Who's keeping track of all of that stuff? Training, okay? This is different training than the lawyer training. This would be, phone person. This would be maybe whoever's doing the motions, or who's doing case management, or what training needs to be done, the intake process, the client interview, who's making sure that these things are getting done. All right, by having SOP, standard operating procedures, hiring and firing. Firing is the worst part about owning a business. I think I really hate it, even when somebody is really out of line. But there is a process, and if you don't follow the process, you could wind up getting sued. You might get sued anyway, but if you follow the process and you make sure that the people are given the right notices and warnings and opportunities to correct, whatever the problem is, and you have properly notified it and notated it, concurrently with when it's going on, you avoid a lot of problems. Hiring, there's a whole process involved in that. Who's in charge of doing that? And one of the biggest things that I think gets overlooked is your office manual. Right? So what's an office manager? Well, if you don't know what an office manual is, you need to learn. But your office manager manual lays out all of the rules, rights, and benefits of your employees. So how much vacation do they get? Do they get paid sick leave? Do they get paid vacation? Is there maternity leave? Do they get PTO? Are they reimbursed for things like driving? I mean, what are the various rules? And they need to be documented because they have to be the same for everybody. And then also, what are your SOPs? How do you do the various jobs, right? Each of these jobs has a description. How do you do that? Okay. And then finally, on the finance side, right? Revenue. Who's tracking your revenue, right? Who's making sure that the check that came in is being accounted for in the right account? Is it going into trust? Is it going into operating? Is it paying a bill or a doctor or an expert or your investigator? Who's tracking that? Somebody has to be responsible for that, right? Bills. Who's paying your bills? You might say, well, you know what? That's all an automatic payment. Well, I would discourage you from that. The problem with automatic payment, is that it's really easy to fall into the thing of having 4 Adobe subscriptions when you only need 1, right? Those subscriptions tend to be an issue. You need to stay on top of it. And who's paying the bill? Who's making sure that the rent's paid? Who's in charge of making sure that the benefits are being paid, right? The people are getting their salaries, getting properly paid. And who do you deal with if your check's wrong, right? And then from these, you're probably going to have a bookkeeper. They might be in-house, and you're probably going to have an accountant. Okay? The key takeaway here: build your org chart based on the tasks that need to be done in your law firm. Have big categories and then subdivide them underneath. The person who does the phone doesn't necessarily do the scripts, but those go together. The person who, you might have a paralegal who does, is responsible for all the discovery. They do, if it comes in, it's going to that person. All right, great. That would be the only thing that they would have on this list as a responsibility. But someone needs to be above that to train that. Who's responsible for that? Who do you go to complain if there is a concern? And who's keeping an eye on making sure that everything is done the way it's supposed to be done? That's what the org chart does for you. And so remember, do it based on the task, and then fit the right people into the seat to do the task. And if you want more information about that, read the book Traction by Gino Wickman. Gino Wickman. And he goes over this, but understanding and having this, and here's the beauty. Once you have this, it's forever, right? The only thing that you change are the people who have the responsibility, but the tasks don't change. So when you look at your organization chart and you go, you know what, we were doing HR by the seat of our pants, really, and now we have, because we only had 2 people, and now we have 20. All right, maybe we need to, change the level of responsibility. Who actually knows what they're doing, right? We might need to hire somebody outside. Maybe you're doing all your bookkeeping in house, and that worked well when you were doing $400,000 a year, but now you're doing $2 million. Does it make sense? Because now it's kind of a full-time gig. Are you doing your own SEO? Really? Those are the kinds of things that, and these do not have to be in-house, right? The person who's doing your SEO could be a vendor that you have hired, but you have to have, who's responsible for keeping an eye on the vendor. All right, everybody. I hope that this has been helpful.